Hello, everybody, and welcome back to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friends today, Charles.
That's right, we have a special guest, don't we?
That we do. We are honored to have author S.T. Gibson. That's S.T. Gibson, aka Saint, is a best-selling British Fantasy Award nominated and Goodreads Choice Award nominated author. Her originally self-published book, the massively successful A Dowry of Blood, which I've read and loved, was sold to Orbit alongside its companion novel, An Education in Malice. Now, Angry Robot Books is publishing Evocation, the first in a new 4-book series. Evocation is due out May 28th, 2024, which is tomorrow if you're listening to this episode on the release date of the episode. Saint has an eclectic set of experiences that we'll get into in this interview here. She is, of course, an author who has worked across multiple publishing houses and done self-publishing, but she has also worked as an agent in the publishing world. She also studied theology at Princeton Seminary, graduated from a creative writing program at UNC Asheville, is a practitioner of folk magic, and that's only a fraction of the interesting things about her. Saint, welcome to Friends Talking Fantasy. We're delighted to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here with you guys.
No,
Yeah, we're really looking forward
pleasure's
to
all
it. We've had
ours.
the chance, to get into Evocation through the arcs that we were so lucky to get. Thank you to Angry Robot Books and to you, Saint. And we had a great time reading the book. We're excited to get into talking about it with you and presenting to our listeners who we know will love the book as well. So we'll get into it. Keep it pretty high level, spoiler free, because we don't want to spoil the book before it's even come out.
Yeah, right.
Always good
Even though we could
practice.
have a whole separate conversation about what goes on in this book, but we'll have to hold our tongues for now.
Yeah, always a balancing act. But Saint, can you give our listeners a brief overview of Evocation and what inspired you to write the story?
I would love to. So, the elevator pitch for Evocation, it is the first book in an urban fantasy romance series, and it follows David, who is a workaholic Boston lawyer and psychic medium who realizes that he is the subject of an ancestral curse, and he is forced to work with his sorcerer ex-boyfriend and the ex-boyfriend's witch wife, the only two people he can trust to break this curse. And big feelings emerge as we try to beat this demon deal. But the series itself is really kind of about the lives and loves and the magical practices of this kind of soap opera interconnected group of occultists who are living in Boston. And so it's a love letter to magic. It's a love letter to love and found family and to the city of Boston, and just a lot of things that are kind of my little pet interests that I got to just cram into this book. And I'm super excited about it. So yeah. And I know you asked a little bit about why I wrote it, and that is truly the truth. This was really me 100%, maybe 110% saying balls to the wall, like no rules. You can put everything you like in a book, and if you can figure out how to make it work, I'll let you keep it. So there's, queer relationships and polyamory. There's all different sorts of living magical traditions. There's religious trauma. There's lots of drama. There's secret societies and secret society rivalries, and just lots of fun, cool, sexy stuff. So I had a great time.
No, yeah, lots of fun, cool,
Absolutely.
sexy stuff indeed. And one of the things that I think was a big standout for me in this book, you had mentioned the polyamory aspect of it.
Mhm.
It's hard not to jump and fixate on that immediately. I feel like that's going to be a really interesting point for a lot of people, is you have
Sure.
like a trio of main characters, and you mentioned kind of the soap opera-y romance part of it. And to me, polyamory in fantasy can go like one of two ways, you know. It can get to be very much like, oh, all the women love me and I get to like just be with all of these women. But, you know,
We've read
we're
a
in
few like that.
2024 now. You mentioned, queer love and representation and all of that. So I'm curious to know, when you started to write this book, did it start out as I want to write a polyamorous relationship? And what was your kind of like philosophy on the approach to representing polyamory in this book?
That's a great question.
Mm,
So I've been writing this book for a minute. This book has been in development for quite a number of years, which for me at least is a little bit longer than usual. I usually spend maybe 1 to 2 years with a book, an average of two, let's say. Um, and so when I started working on the Summoner Circle series, specifically Evocation, I hadn't really found my voice and found my way into the fact that a lot of my work, arguably most of my work, features and celebrates the wonderfulness and the messiness and the complexities of queer love, queer family, and queer friendship, and
mm,
often features polyamorous relationships or kind of complex family systems or groups of friends or gangs of people that are really interlocked in different ways. And I think that is just because I truly am that sap at the end of the day who believes that love and friendship is powerful, it is revolutionary, it can save you, it can reshape history, but it can also be a point of contention. It can also cause a lot of pain, it can cause a lot of breakdowns in relationships and things like that. And I'm just really
mm,
fascinated by that duality. So I
mm,
feel like it was natural that the book would kind of shift into being more romantic or more polyamorous or just a little bit more relationally complex as I wrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it. But actually, with this one, it was not super the intention in the beginning. When I first developed the character of David, who is kind of the focal point of this story, all the Summoner Circle books are multi POV, but each one kind of focuses in on one person's personal development, magical problems, love life, and kind of
Mm,
spotlights them. When I first developed David, he was not the center of the story. But he was a really interesting dynamic character. And I was really fascinated by how he was kind of like a catalyst agent when he was introduced into other people's lives. And I just was really interested in exploring that. And I think that led me down the road that we have arrived at now. But for me, at least with Evocation, and some of my other work is a little bit more, I would say, operatic. It's a little bit more larger than life, super fantastical, huge feelings. The curtain comes down and the audience cries, like that kind of thing. Whereas Evocation is a bit more, it's still fun and it's still fantastical, but it is really grounded in our world, magic systems that either are one-to-one representations or inspired by magic systems or religious and philosophical systems that exist in our world, and like cities that exist in our world, and kind of the messiness and the complexities and the trials and travails of trying to make friends and be in love as an adult who needs
mm.
to pay rent and hold down a job. So it was really important for me in writing Evocation to kind of dig into that friction, to play with that mess, and to also open up moments of tenderness and connection and genuine love and friendship. I guess I wanted to do something that was a little bit closer to our reality, even though it is very much still a fun supernatural romp. So that kind of guided some of the decisions I made with some of the conversations and some of the plot points that are highlighted in the book.
Yeah, that definitely comes across. It's
Okay.
such a deeply intimate story, I feel like, when it comes
Yeah.
to the characters and the relationships. Like, there is fun and there is magic, but to me, it came across as like all about these characters and their
Mhm.
relationships to each other. And you mentioned David, who I'm glad you mentioned that he's the catalyst to the whole story. That's definitely how it comes across. It starts with him and everything kind of moves around him. He's this fascinating character with, he's got a lot of personal demons, some of them
Mhm.
literal. And I'm curious, was it like writing a character like that who's dealing with so many complex things like family legacy and psychic abilities. It was such a big personality, but also keeping him like sticking to the plot and keeping him like from taking over the whole show in relation to the other characters, Reese and is it pronounced Mara? How do I
Moira.
pronounce it?
Moira.
Moira? Okay.
Moira, yes.
That's how
Thank
I
you for
read it.
asking.
Moira?
Ah, nice.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah. So how do you keep them from stealing the show, and how do you explore the themes through this character of David?
Yeah, so there's layers to this answer. I think one, just from a technical perspective, as the author, as the one who has her hands on the reins, I know that the characters that I have in mind to spotlight and showcase in each book do get to steal the show in their own book. So that kind of allows me to decide what to put in and what to hold back and be like, your arc is coming, like, we're going to get to it in a book or two. But I kind of had permission with this one to be like, this is really David's moment. He does a lot of the growth that he goes through in the series, kind of in this really tight timeline of one book. So that was really helpful framing it that way. And then I do agree with you. David is kind of he is a bit of a larger than life character. He has a very big presence. The thing that I found really fun about writing this character is there are elements of like kind of fantasy or like power fantasy or like a bit of an overpowered, like, if you're building a video game character, like he's rich, he's hot, he's psychic, he's a lawyer, like all these things that are really fun to just let yourself be like, I know this is a little bit much, but like, we're going to do it. We're going to have a good time. But then tempering that with it being a pretty introspective book that is really about a lot of his personal failings and his trauma and his inability to open up and be in intimate relationship with other people without spoiling too much. That's kind of his big issue is he's a workaholic, he's a recovering addict, and he really has a hard time relating to other people outside of seeing his own existence as a constant performance and constantly striving for success and acclaim and applause. So that was kind of a really fun tension to play with where like I get to give him, some of the really fun one-liners and the cool car and the cool job, but I also got to go a little bit deeper than maybe I would in a different book with a different character into what makes him tick. And I I think every author puts a little bit of themselves and the people they love into any book they write. I would say the Summoner Circle series for me is probably a little bit closer, not closer to me, but it's definitely me working through shit about myself and about my own life and in the books. And it's been interesting to kind of crack the code to realize like these people feel a lot more real and their arcs have a lot more depth and meaning if you aren't afraid to go there and you aren't afraid to, as the author, as the artist, get a little vulnerable and put some of the parts of you in the book that like aren't very attractive. So I'm someone who can really kind of fall into that spiral of I got to work all the time. I'm only valuable if I'm successful. I quote unquote earn love by performing and by being, on top of my game. Like I can really kind of get into that David mindset. And so once I realized as I was writing and rewriting this book and working on this character, I was like, okay, you're workshopping some of your own personal demons with his personal demons. I think that really helped to kind of guide the conversations I was having with myself as the artist, and then the conversations that the characters were allowed to have with each other. So those were some of the kind of guidelines I worked with. But beyond having those guidelines, I kind of just let myself go a little bit wild with this one and just really have fun and lean into a bit of the, maybe it's not quite camp, but I keep coming back to the word soapy. It feels a bit like those CW shows like Supernatural or Riverdale or Nancy Drew, like and I wanted it to feel that way. I wanted it to feel like a really fun romp while still getting deep into some of the trauma and some of the interpersonal issues and those growing edges for growth that we encounter in our lives as human beings.
No, that's really thoughtful and introspective, and it's so interesting having read the book before meeting you, before having this conversation, because hearing you say that, it's like I'm putting pieces together, because when you
Yeah, it
read a
tracks.
lot of like romantasy, you think of like all the steamy details, all the hot and heavy action, right? Which this book has, don't get me wrong. But what kind of stuck out to me as part of the romantasy aspect of this book is you do layer it with, and we're talking about David specifically right now. It's
Hmm.
like he he's got the MX black card, the fancy cars, the suits, he has all those things. But so of course you think, oh, he's just gonna have, these really exciting romantic encounters all the time. But really the romance comes from like the walls that he puts down and the vulnerabilities, right? And
Hmm.
you find the intimacy in that, which to me is very interesting because it would have been so easy to be like, and then he unbutton his shirt and you have to see the six-pack abs, like which, we'll get into that. Don't worry. But he's not like that's, it's only after we kind of develop this intense, like emotional connection and you see I show a side of myself that I would have never thought to have shown for
Hmm.
whatever reason about my background that we won't get into, read and find out. But it's definitely the vulnerability and intimacy that to me was really interesting about this because it would have been just so easy to have three interesting people just having romantic encounters for 300
Yeah.
pages, but it's kind of interesting to see you going through that process of finding out like, what is intimacy to you and how you work in some of those vulnerabilities to create the same effect is quite interesting.
Yeah. I think something cool, at least for me, about writing a book that is polyamorous or features relationships with more permeable boundaries that is set in our world is
Mhm.
there's a little bit more room for the characters to define what intimacy or what friendship or what love means for them, and that's been really enjoyable as well.
Mm. That's really interesting. I think that the different point of views they provide both these different perspectives on love and how people take love, how people receive, how people give love. All that kind of stuff is different in each point of view. And I think that one of the great strengths of your writing and this book is your ability to flesh out characters by presenting them through multiple different point of views. And I feel like sometimes it feels like an author like they see the character a certain way, and maybe for
Hmm.
David it is like fancy car, he's hot, he's got everything going for him. And then even if they have multiple point of views, it's just everyone sees him as, oh, it's a hot guy with the awesome car and
Exactly.
all this stuff. But for you it feels like the character development takes place, like each character, like David's character development is through three different point of views in three
Hmm.
totally unique ways. And each point of view allows us to see a different side of them. And you kind of piece it together a little bit more. Like, is this something that you do consciously or deliberately? Like, oh, like, Reese sees this part of him, so I'm going to put that in over here, but David can't see that in himself. Like, do you do that? Or does it just come out naturally because you're in each character's point of view, writing what they're perceiving?
So I'm a bit of a headlights writer, and what I mean by that is, at least at this point in my career, I do have to outline and do synopses a bit more just by nature of the beast to be able to like sell my next book and be like, listen, I do have a plan. Like I'm not going to go totally off the rails. And I do think it's been a benefit for me as a writer to push myself and to learn to be a bit more structured and to have a bit more of a plan. But I do kind of naturally lean a bit more towards being an exploratory writer, having the next couple of chapters nailed down and then kind of seeing where they take me and writing towards like what I call set piece scenes, which are like big midpoint scenes or like, a big gala or a big fight or something. And we're kind of getting there and then we get to the
Mm.
climax. But I it's funny, like I'm always every time I finish a book that is multi POV, I'm like, I'm not doing this next time. I'm not making more work for myself. One POV, baby, that's the way to go. But I do really just get, if you can't tell for anyone listening, if you haven't read the book, I'm a super character driven writer and I've just accepted that about myself. I've stopped trying to fight it. I do think a lot of my strengths comes from centering character development and relationships and then kind of building out the plot from there to make it suit what's going on internally. That's kind of how I reverse engineer it. But I do love the reason I keep coming back to multi-POV for a lot of projects, and especially for the Summoner Circle series, which has such a big cast, who many of whom have known each other for years and years and years. Exactly to your point, is for that reason, because like when we are describing ourselves or our own lives, whether we're a book narrator or just talking in the mirror to our friends or leaving ourselves a voice note, like we're quite limited in our perception of ourselves. And we're coming from a lot of internalized biases or messages we got as kids, or a person we want to be, the vision we have of ourselves. And sometimes it takes someone who loves you, or someone who's really mad at you and doesn't currently feel a lot of love for you, to have a little bit more of an accurate read on what's going on. So yeah, I love just putting people in jars and shaking them and putting them into situations and putting pressure on them and seeing what happens. But especially with the trio in Evocation, I think that the way that Rhys, Moira, and David view each other, and they kind of circle each other tighter and tighter, like these orbiting bodies, as the book goes on, and they all get closer, and they kind of hurt each other more, but also experience more intimacy as they get closer and closer. It does reveal really, really cool things about the other characters that I, as the writer, would be really limited in. Like, Evocation would be unreadable if it was just David talking, like, because he just doesn't have the depth of self-awareness and the depth of deep awareness of others at the beginning that would be needed to make him a good narrator. So by introducing Rhys and Moira, who are such different people from him and from each other, I do think it creates kind of this little balanced triangle, like this three-legged stool, that it's all these focal points talking to each other. At least that's what I hope it does. I had fun. That's what
No, for sure. I would agree. The book is very character driven. And I think that's what, when you introduce a character like Rhys, for example, the second member of our trio here, and they have this from the beginning of the book, they have this complicated past with each other, and they have different perspectives on what happened in their past, where it's like, oh, I see it this way, you see it that way, we can't agree. So it's interesting to get into their perspectives that way, and you kind of see, like, you see their personalities just through this like shared conflict that they have and how they interpret it. It's very interesting. I was wondering if you could tell us specifically with Rhys how you approach that relationship between Rhys and David, and like how the character of Rhys came to be in a very kind of, while this book is more David centric, it's still a trio, and how Rhys kind of fits into that.
Yeah, I love Rhys. And I think something I'm really enjoying currently in the writing process is I'm writing book 2 right now, or rather revising it, which is Rhys's book.
Nice.
So I kind of got to leave all these breadcrumbs in the first book emotionally, and set up some strengths and also some weaknesses in book 1 for Rhys that he's really going to have to face in book 2. And that was really enjoyable. Like, he does grow and show up for people in book 1, but there's still a lot of space for development. And I think the people who love him in his life definitely have notes. Will be true for everyone when we get to their book. So that was a fun process to kind of set him up for his moment while making sure the spotlight stayed mostly on David. But I really enjoyed developing that character. He's slightly inspired in some ways by some people who I love very much. And it's just kind of a snapshot in time in that way, which is really, really cool. But, he's like, I tend to write, there's almost one in every book, that character, and there's multiple in this series, but that character who is like driven by this bottomless ambition, like, and just like who can very easily access these emotions of like greed and ambition and that will to power. And Rhys really can access that drive quite easily. Arguably, he's currently ruled by it. And that was really cool to explore. I just find it really fascinating. And I think you can explore that motif in so many different ways through history, and it never gets boring. Like, it's very like Dr. Faustus, Rhys is that like academic sorcerer who doesn't know his limits, who doesn't believe he's allowed to have them, and who will put way too much on the line to get that knowledge, power, money, status, access. but it does come from a place of growing up without a lot of money, power, status, access, and feeling very much on the margins of his own life as someone who is from a working class poor family, as someone who's from Southie, as a bisexual man, as someone that didn't have access to the best books and the best education, and who does not come from magical lineage. That's very important. A lot of the characters in the book, like their family taught them something, or they went to an expensive school, or they've been in training since they were very young. Reese is almost entirely self-taught. So when you throw that that tangle of inadequacy and ego in with someone like David, who's also a tangle of a very different inadequacy and ego, it does create sparks, which is very, very fun. And they are kind of, I think some of the language I use in the book is binary stars. Like they're opposites, but they're in this magnetic field where they can't quite get away from each other. And in that magnetic field, they are complementary if they can find balance. And that was just really, really fun to explore. But I can never resist a little bit of extra tension and a little bit of extra conflict. Like even my most cozy romances, which arguably Evocation, this series is more cozy for me than like my vampire books. You still have that element of angst. But I think that's where the juice is, and that's where the growth happens and the opportunities for connection are. So that's a little bit about how I view him. I really love Reese. I could talk about him all day. And I have noticed just from early reviews that he is maybe one of the more divisive characters, which I find really interesting. Like people tend to really either love him or really dislike him, which is fine. That is a sign I'm doing my job well at this point in the series.
For sure.
But I am interested to see kind of how he develops and how I develop as an artist working with this character for like multiple books in the future for many years as well.
How do you think people have such controversial opinions about Reese, do you think? Because I find that interesting.
Yeah, I don't even necessarily think it's controversial. And I really only read the reviews that I'm tagged in or that folks send me. I've learned boundaries. We're a work in progress, but we love boundaries. But people tend to either, I think because Reese has a very strong personality, which is only going to get stronger. Like he's kind of still baby when we meet him. He's only 26. I think they tend to either resonate with like this drive, this ambition, this sense of like, I have to know, like, I want the knowledge, I want the power, and I'm not going to apologize for that. Like, this is intrinsic to who I am. You love me because I have made myself into this, right? Or they really bounce off that and they're like, he's so selfish. And I'm like, yeah, he is. That's a big issue. We're going to get into it.
Yes.
But I think there's that element of a lot of the characters in these books do have a little bit of a touch of self-interest because they're all sorcerers and magicians. And I will say from my own experience, some magical practitioners are incredibly, what's the word, altruistic. They're incredibly others oriented, but a lot of us come to it from a place of, I want to be better myself, or I want to be someone a little bit different, or I want access to the mysteries. And that does create some big personalities that can come into conflict. So I think that might be the reason why.
That's really interesting. I found myself gravitating toward Reese, and now I'm wondering what that says about me.
I am an apologist for him. I think it's great.
I think I might be a Reese apologist as well. Like in my eyes, he was this character that I'm glad you brought up all the power and the ambition and all that kind of stuff. It was like he came off, especially at first, as very like, oh, like he's very sensible, maybe he gets caught up in things, that kind of stuff. And then kind of for me, it was more like breadcrumbs I was starting to see of like, oh wait, this guy has some real crap to work out around his ambition, around his power, and around selfishness like you mentioned. And I guess something also about him that kind of makes him different than the other two characters is the extent to which he has a past with the other two characters is much greater than
like because that's the word I'm looking for.
Like Moira and David, you get to kind of see them develop their relationship together to a much greater extent than you see Reese develop his relationship with the other two, because David's his ex and Moira's his wife. but Moira and David hate each other at the start of
Hmm.
the book.
Hmm.
And then you see them kind of grow together in a way Reese isn't given the opportunity to. But it has me super excited about where you take Reese with some of these breadcrumbs that you left us in the
Thank
next
you.
book.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
it's
I feel like it
exciting.
can be so easy to be like, oh, I like the privileged guy I don't like as much as the guy who like came up from nothing. And then you
Yeah.
start to reveal some of the duality of that because he's a real you're character driven, right? So of course he has to have some character flaws. So then people see that and they're like, whoa, whoa. The person that I like has character flaws? What? That doesn't seem I don't like that. So I could see some of that. But to me, it's like when your story is so character driven and then like vulnerability is a big part of the intimacy that drives the romance. It's those things that those breadcrumbs that are just drive a lot of the intrigue for me and keep those relationships constantly volatile because you never know when they're going to do something that's going to shake up the balance. They're always at
Mhm.
each other's throats. And honestly, I'm sure David and Reese would have killed each other in the first couple chapters if it wasn't for our third character, Moira.
Truly.
So want to make sure we give Moira her due because to me, she's the one like her POV I found very fun and almost humorous because she can see through the bullshit a lot of times
Yeah.
and she can kind of these two she can kind of like tame these two wild horses almost kind of is how I see it. It's like she's the one that's kind of keeping this thing together. So I'm wondering, what your inspirations were for her character. You mentioned you saw a lot of yourself in David and people in your life kind of inspired Reese, but what was some of the inspiration for creating Moira as the third person in this polyamorous story?
Yeah, I mean, I see a ton of myself in Moira as well, and I'll probably speak on that in a year or two when we're closer to her having her moment in the sun. But
Hmm.
Moira is really like when I was developing her early in the beginning, I kind of gave myself this challenge because and this was years ago. This is probably 6 or 7 years ago, but I had found myself as I was getting into writing more that when I wrote female characters, when I wrote women, I tended to write a certain kind of woman over and over and over again, which is cool and fun. Like these are really like outgoing, ambitious, hungry, lusty kind
Mm.
of girls. And I write them a lot. I love those kinds of characters who are a little bit almost more like Reese, like women who are like, I want the world and I'm going to get it, hell or high water. And with Moira, I was like, I want to create someone who is still has that really rounded, or not rounded, grounded, rooted depth, and who has like her access to her power and to her anger and to all of these more tempestuous emotions, but who leads with love and who enters
Mm.
into situations being like my gentleness and my vulnerability and my willingness to talk things through is my greatest asset. This is my superpower. And that was a kind of a really fun challenge for me. And now I've written a lot of different kind of female characters, but Moira was really me being like, I want to create someone who is allowed to be in some ways traditionally feminine without losing respect, esteem, power, all this kind of stuff. So that was kind of
Mm.
the seed that was planted. And then the more time I spent with her, as it goes with any character you develop, I was like, oh, there's so much more to her that is really, really fun and cool. Um, I think in Evocation, she really kind of is this middle point between Reese and David, who can be a little bit more volatile. But the cool thing about Moira, at least to me, is that she can really unlock parts of both those men that they can't even unlock with each other, no matter how much
Mhm.
they love each other and how well they know each other. And that is very cool. And arguably, David can unlock parts of Moira that Reese can't access. And
Yeah.
as the book and the series goes on, they do have this really unique, intimate connection, even though it's not necessarily sexual, that is like, yeah, Reese isn't necessarily in this conversation. And
Mhm.
once I realized that that was the direction things were going in, then we really started cooking with gas. Like I really started to have a
Yeah.
good time. And I think I got a little bit deeper into what was going on with them. But like, I mean, Moira does come from more of a family and community based tradition. Like she
Mhm.
learned her style of magic. She's a very adept tarot reader and astrologer, and she's also informed by the root work she learned from her grandmother and kind of the small business ownership she learned from her mom to running this business out of her house, essentially. And so she is kind of shored up by this tradition of familial love and lineage and stories and folklore and recipes that have been passed down that Reese is kind of bereft of. I think that maybe that is a point where they can heal each other if they can get over the fact that they don't have similar upbringings in that way very much. But yeah, she's really cool, and she is kind of like, whenever I put her in a scene, especially if it's like a scene where maybe she wasn't originally in just because there's too many cast members on stage or she's doing something else, and then I'm like, actually she needs to be in here to hear this conversation, like I'll put her in for a very technical reason, and there's just this really cool element that gets added when she's there, because to your point, she's like incredibly insightful with people. She's
Mhm.
no bullshit, she's kind, she's gentle, if she, not always, but mostly she's kind and gentle, but she really, really knows people's hearts. And when you put someone like that into a situation, you kind of get right to the meat of the conversation.
Yeah.
You get right to the problem, because it's hard to talk in circles when she's in the room. And that's something I really like about the character.
Yeah, and something that's super impressive about what she helps you do is it runs so counter to this like miscommunication trope that's so
Oh, we're not
tired
doing
in
that here.
stories where it's like you see the entire plot revolving around like, oh, this character said this and then that character didn't let them finish talking and walked out the door, and it's like, no, actually, if I could just explain. It's like, no, we just don't do that because Moira's in this story and she, like you said, leads with love. She leads with that gentleness, but being straightforward and communicating is
Yeah.
so important to her. And there's no way around doing that for the other two characters who might be a little more volatile and prone to falling into some of those trappings. So it's so great to see a romantasy where it's like, no, we just don't do that miscommunication trope. Like it's all the real stuff that does cause drama in itself.
Thank you. And to your very first question you asked, I think it was actually Charles who asked this, but I think, at least for this story, the reason that the polyamory was so important to me early on was I was
Mm,
like, if you remove one of these characters, one side of the triangle,
Mm,
you lose so much of the room that the other characters grow into emotionally, the room that they have to access their own magical abilities, their own power. So I really do think they all kind of light up different parts of each other, and there is something really really magical about that. That once I
mhm.
realized that that was kind of what was going on, I was like, we got to run with this. So yeah, she's a really important part of that.
for sure. It's almost like um, it's hard to imagine the other two being able to have a story in this book without her, and it's one of those things where you're bringing these three characters together, and Moira, I don't know, like for me, she's just she's has this ability to see into the other characters. And we talked about the use of POV, and one of the
Mm-hmm.
more interesting experiences that I had reading this book was just watching how kind of she's the one where people's POVs kind of contrast the most from what they think of themselves, because you mentioned she is that perceptive.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of this book that wouldn't have been possible if she wasn't there. But she's not necessarily the peacekeeper as much as she is the one who is trying to get to the vulnerable parts of these people. It's like, hey, I see the trauma that you're carrying, or I see the issues that you have. Like, you can bring those down with us, like if we're going to
Mm-hmm.
work together, this is how it's going to go. And
Exactly.
it's a really unique element to a story. It's not like a rom-com like Dylan mentioned, where it's like, oh no, I
No.
didn't. It's like like something really inconvenient happened that makes, I'll have to profess my love again in the third act for you to love me again. It's like, no, no, it doesn't happen here. There's a lot of sitting around and working through stuff as a trio that is super interesting for a romantasy book and for a fantasy book in general of like, she's the one that's like, let's sit down and talk. And
Mhm.
it creates some really interesting character development, you know? So it's that deliberate choice that through Moira is possible. So big fan.
Thank you.
And you know, we've done the deep dive of the characters. We've talked about the romance, which I'm sure we'll keep getting into. But one of the things that I want to get into is all the supernatural elements and the magic,
Let's
because
go.
big draw of the book, right? So, you know, reading your bio, there are so many things that I was like, "Ooh, that's interesting. Got to ask about that. Got to ask about that." And I'm sure so much of these things, like practitioner of folk magic, studied theology at the Princeton Seminary, can you tell us a little bit about the I'll say magic system, but the
Yeah,
supernatural elements of
totally.
evocation and maybe how some of your background played a part in the development of this magic system?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I said before, this is really me just like pushing everything that I love and am interested in learning about into a book, which is great because then you have an excuse to research the things you're interested in for years because you're writing a series.
Right.
So I really won with that one. But yeah,
Very
I
Reese of you. Ooh, I get to study
truly,
forever.
listen, we could get into it. We're not going to get into it, but truly, it all comes from a very real place. But yeah, I've been a very religiously, spiritually oriented person since like I came out of the womb. Like I love religion and spirituality the way that I love art and the way that I love love. Like it's very foundational to myself. And I've gone through much spiritual evolution in my life. I've been in and out of different religious groups. I've studied different magical systems. I would say right now I identify as Episcopalian and a folk practitioner, but I do have a theology degree from Princeton Seminary because I went to school to train to be an Episcopalian priest. And then pretty quickly after getting there, I was like, I don't want to do this. I think I want to write smutty romance books instead, which is a very like 180 term, but it all comes back together. But I did have a really wonderful experience during my 2 years. I got my master's in theological studies, and it's not a formal concentration, but I spent most of my time studying like theological or not theological church trends and also theology and art. So I was really into like what kind of art are people making to make sense of the spiritual world? How does that play out in different times and in different cultures and in different countries? And what are the current trends in like how folks are orienting themselves to spirituality now, which I think are all things that do come into the book in some way or another. But I ended up just spending a lot of my time when I should have been studying for like my church history exams, chilling in like this little occult section of the library. The Princeton Seminary Library is like one of the best theological libraries in the world. It's truly amazing. The collection is a huge gift, and I'm amazed that I had access to it. And there is a section that has a lot of like classical occult texts, spiritualism writings, things like that that are really, really cool. And I was just going through these old books kind of for my own pleasure and research. And I was like, I have to do something with this. And I just am kind of like a little Roomba that goes around humanity and just picks up all these little like facts and tidbits and practices from different magic systems and different religious systems. So my hope, my ultimate goal with this series is that I could create a very magical world that was incredibly close to the one we live in which almost all, if not all, of the magical traditions and practices and the religious practices present were deeply rooted in real, living, diverse traditions. And it's been a wonderful opportunity for me to learn more and to correct myself and to grow, and just to do that continuing education because I'm a huge nerd about this kind of stuff. But I mean, I think this is really a situation where it's like truth is stranger than fiction sometimes. I love to create a from scratch magic system. Like my I'm well known for doing vampires. I was like, we're gonna do what I say goes. Like, we're not rooting this in anything. It's gonna be, can't go out in the sun, all this kind of stuff. But yeah, the Summoner Circle series is just a wonderful invitation for me to stay curious and to stay agile and to stay learning. And I really hope that if anyone reads this book and they're like, oh, that's so cool, like I want to know about chaos magic, or like I want a tarot deck, like there are resources out there where you can learn a little bit more. Proceed with caution, proceed with care, do your critical thinking. But if you are a person that is interested in these kinds of things, it excited me to think that that someone could take something that they saw in this book and then go learn about it and learn something new about history or about the way different people live. And that was really neat to me.
Yeah, it's interesting because you have, seances, tarot card
Yeah,
readings, astrology, like all of these different, like very much practiced real elements of magic that you bring into this. And it's the setting is like a pretty much a modern day Boston as well. So to combine those two things and bring just a little oomph of fantastical into it to make
exactly.
some of these seances come to life and to have some real world implications to, reading as some of these charts and readings and things. It's an interesting blend, and I know you've mentioned like that brings it into like that urban fantasy kind
Hmm.
of realm as well, which I think is really interesting. And it's interesting to hear your background and your various studies of these things. It does come across. It just feels like you're in the academic magical world of Boston. Like it's like, oh, I specialize in this with a minor in this, and you specialize in
But
this,
that's
and
what the city
yeah,
feels like.
yeah, exactly.
As I have not, I'm not a native. I would never claim that, but I did live in Boston for 4 years, and I'm very close to Boston now, and I'm there frequently, either to see friends
Mhm.
or go to restaurants or do research for the books. And there's a ton of universities and libraries in the city. There's a ton of different immigrant communities, ethnic groups, languages. Like, and Boston has its own complicated history and all that kind of stuff. It's by no means a perfect city, but I just never get tired of it. And it really seemed like a really good place to explore these things. Obviously, the demon deal is a little bit of artistic license, but I promise you drama, and I will never not give you drama. But in terms of what folks are doing day in and day out and the language they use to describe themselves, that's all coming from people I know, things I've done myself, ways I've identified myself, or research that I have done. So yeah.
It really shines through with how natural it all feels and how the characters communicate with each other in a way that it's like you really just feel like an observer of everything that's going on in their lives. And it doesn't feel like they're providing you exposition. They're just living their lives together, and they're doing it in Boston, which I do have to mention that Charles has deep Boston roots, right, Charles? So
For
I'm sure
real?
you appreciated that
Yeah.
aspect of it.
Yeah, I was born there and I have a lot of my whole mom's side of my family lives there, so I'm there all the time. So it's fun to read like the setting of Boston, that's not Goodwill Hunting, so
I want more Boston urban fantasy. I want more Boston literary fiction. I mean, there's a lot out there already, but I do think when people think urban fantasy, they go immediately New York, Chicago, Seattle,
Yeah.
when we're thinking of American cities. And I was
Mhm.
like, well, this is a city that I love and I know a little bit more about than New York. So like, we'll just do it here.
Sure, and there's those academic ties to Boston as well that
Exactly.
you have
Yeah.
those magical societies and everything that comes with that, which I think was a really interesting flavor of the city of Boston to bring in to the magic system as well. So no, it's definitely all there. So that was to me a really interesting part of the magic system. And then, you have demons and possession and stuff like that. So uh, I guess when you balance a book that has you're balancing this triangle relationship, you're working in all these elements, you're connecting to it intimately, personally. Um, how do you go about? Because to me, the main part of this book, I'm like, this book is fun at the end of the day. There's really fun romantic moments. There's really fun, like I guess you could call them magical like moments. I don't
Huh.
want to get into too much, but how do you go about balancing? Like, did you set out to be like, okay, this book is going to like be entertaining, and I'm going to write entertaining moments,
Right.
or are you just kind of fulfilling your vision of the characters. Like, how do you balance that in a book like this that gets pretty personal?
Yeah, so I think every writer is different. Every author is different when it comes to this. As an author, I my ultimate goal with any book, like at the highest level, is to entertain, to make you feel big emotions and deep sensation. I'm very into that. And to give you a couple of things maybe to chew on and think about. Like
Mhm.
that is kind of how I approach this, kind of this hierarchy of needs. It's like top level, everyone's going to have a good time, right? I want the plot to hold together. I want it to be fun, sexy, musical numbers, costume changes. Like we're going to have a good time. And
Mhm.
then I do really want to encourage the audience to feel those big feelings and those intense sensations, and maybe get outside their comfort zone slightly with some things, and kind of go there emotionally, because that
Mhm.
is something that I really look for in the fiction that I consume. And then, right at the very, very top, little capstone, I'm like, and maybe you'll learn something, and maybe you'll reflect, and if you don't, you had fun.
Yes, we
So
laugh,
yeah,
we
I
learn, we
really
love.
go ahead. I'm so sorry, I cut you off.
Oh no, I'm just saying we laugh, we learn, we love. The
We laugh, we
dialogue
learn, we
can be very
love.
funny a lot of times too. I'll say like they just exchange quips with each other all the time, even in the most heavy of moments. So I appreciate that
Especially
aspect of it.
the secret society scenes. I had a blast every time I get to
Mm.
write a scene that's just society boys. I'm like, this is great. um but I, at least with this one, my balancing act was not so much the entertainment and the personal, but I don't often feel this urge. But because this series is so many things that I have a lot of experience with, or have done a lot of reading on, or just spend a lot of my downtime thinking about, I had to do a lot of editing to keep from info dumping. And there are
Mm.
occasional moments where it's appropriate, but like the original version of this book, like the first or second draft, it would just be pages of like David and Moira talking about like astrological transits. That doesn't matter. What is the key takeaway here for the audience? Or it would be just Reese basically lecturing the audience for a page and a half. He's a good little hack as the writer, because he is a researcher by trade. So if I need someone to kind of do ex machina,
Mm.
come into a scene and be like, here's three very dense sentences about what's happening with some keywords, he can do it.
Mm.
But yeah, so I had to kind of pare that back and just remind myself, like, you don't know everything you're talking about. There's a lot of gaps in your knowledge, so let's not highlight them moreover. And B, people want to have a good time. They want to go on an emotional journey. They want to have the chills and the thrills, and they
Mm.
want that sense of catharsis at the end. So I really kept that front and center. But yeah, there was a lot of pruning in some of the
Mm.
earlier drafts where I just was like, I'm so excited about this because I read so much about this. It's like, we don't need to know.
It's a good skill, really. It's a tough
Yeah.
skill, the
I
editing
have very good beta
down.
readers. Elizabeth
Mm.
Kilcoyne, if you're out there, you saved me.
Shout out, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's uh I mean it's not shocking to hear that you want info dump because it's something you're super passionate about, but having seen the finished product of your editing and all that kind of stuff, it is surprising to hear that there was that much info dumping, because I thought one of the strengths of the writing is that it always feels like the world building is not for world building's sake. It's serving the characters foremost
Thank
and the
you.
plot as well. Like
Yeah.
I I guess like you're saying, I'm realizing now I'm seeing how the sausage is made a little bit hearing you talk, where it's like, oh well, when if Reese is going off a little bit too much, a little too info dumpy, it actually just feels like character development or like character
Mhm.
building, because it's
Yeah.
like, oh, that's exactly what he would do because he's an academic type. And
Mhm.
it I guess it feels just like it's serving his character development, but you're sneakily informing us about the world. So well
Exactly.
done.
And shout out to my editorial team and my agent. A lot of hands touched this very lovingly and very thoroughly before it got to the version it is now. So I'm incredibly fortunate in that regard.
It's an interesting process because it, it's there is so much that people love about tarot card reading and astrology and seances and stuff that you could indulge in that so easily. I feel like it's a common pitfall for authors to step into, that it's good
Mm.
to have that strong team around you and good beta readers and stuff to service the characters and the story and the entertainment value first. And so it's a really good balance.
Thanks.
So we're nearing the end here, so I want to make sure we cut enough time to talk about some of the other work you have going on. So we're talking
Oh,
up
sure.
Evocation today. So I want to make sure that everybody, if you made it this far, then at this point you have to check it out. Because how could you not see what we're talking about? That this is highly recommended. And you mentioned that this is, part of a series. You're already working on the next book. It's more Reese focused. What else can we expect coming from ST Gibson in the not so distant future? What are we working on?
So the two things I have on my plate, which are kind of like the two sides of my brain right now that I'm really excited about, is of course developing the Summoner Circle series we've been talking about this entire time. Thank you so much for having me. So yeah, book 2 is Reese's book, book 3 is Moira's book, and book 4, you may have to wait for me to tell you who it is. I know who it
I
is.
was curious.
I'm taking guesses.
I was like, let's see, 4 books.
Yeah.
Each book's character focused. We have 3 characters. I was doing the math myself. I was like,
wait a minute, this is not adding up.
She's up to something.
They form into like a Voltron figure by the end, and it's just single point of view.
Not quite. But yeah, working on Summoner Circle. I'm gonna be locked and loaded for that for the next couple of 3 years, which is a wonderful blessing. As a artist, I'm a little bit, I get bored easy. I like to challenge myself and try new things all the time. So the fact that I care enough and have put enough time and effort into this book and these characters that I'm excited about doing it for 4 years is kind of amazing. But I am also, so this is Angry Robot, Summoner Circle. But I'm also working on a trilogy for Orbit. The first book in the trilogy is called Savage Blooms. You can add it to Goodreads. It's not available for pre-order anywhere yet, but you can add it to Goodreads or Storygraph if you want to bookmark it.
What was this? Savage what? Was it?
Savage Blooms, like flowers.
Oh, blooms. Because I was like, it also sounded like she said Savage Balloons, but I don't think she wrote that. That's another story.
The title's in the works.
Funny, though.
That sounds like a Stephen King book where he's just desperate to get something out. It's like Savage Balloons. That's the story. It's about an evil balloon. I don't know, a clown. Savage Balloons. That sounds much more intriguing.
That is a trilogy. And that one, if you are a listener and you're a reader of me and you liked Dowry because it was really dark and very angsty and really emotional and sexy, you'll probably also like this trilogy coming from Orbit. It is an erotic romance fantasy trilogy. It's polyamorous. It is terrible people doomed by the narrative, madly in love, having kinky hookups on the moors in Scotland and trying to get out of ancient fairy enchantment. So it's a little bit darker, it's a little bit sexier, it's a little bit edgier, but as I like to think with all of my work, it is grounded in intimacy and care and has a happy ending. So I'm really excited about that, but I'm truly blessed because those are kind of two different sides of my brain. Like on one side of my brain, it's always raining and it's like Wuthering Heights and there's lightning and people are crying. Other side of my brain, it's just like Moira and David getting coffee in Boston. It's great.
That's exciting. I'm looking forward to those. Do you have a sense when, maybe you said it already, when people can roughly expect to see the first book in that trilogy?
In the trilogy, it will be fall 2025. So we're still a ways out. I'm still cooking it, or I'm still in the kitchen, but I'm really, really excited about that. And the timeline for Summoner Circle is right now generally a book a year. But I know myself and I'm a human, and I also tend to get very lost in the weeds of dev editing. So if we have to push it, we will. But right now we are on schedule. We're feeling good and we're shooting for a book a year.
Wow.
You've got a lot going on. So I think
sure do.
we'll understand if you don't hit that book a year while you're working on other projects as well. And you're also keeping busy now because you've got some book tours coming up. Can you tell us about those and how folks can come meet you?
I would love to. So if you are listening to this when it drops, I will be actively in the United Kingdom. I am doing
Wow.
London, Liverpool, Bath, Birmingham, and then up to Scotland to do a couple days in Edinburgh, one of my favorite cities in the world. I'm so excited. I believe there are still some tickets left for some of the events, but some of them have sold out. So I would just double check. But I will be at MCM Comic Con and I will be at Chimera Fest in Edinburgh. If you're going to either of those festivals, if you see me, say hello. We can take a picture. I'll sign a book, no problem. If you can't get a ticket to the events. But I am super spoiled, super blessed, so excited. Scotland, I know I adore. I went there a couple years ago, and I've always wanted to go to London. I've always wanted to go to Bath and some other places in the UK that I get to visit. And the best part is that I get to meet my very lovely UK readers. I have awesome readers all over the world and in the States, but the UK has really shown up and shown out for me ever since my career started. So it feels good to be able to go and give some love back.
Oh, that's awesome. That sounds super exciting, and that's very impressive. Between all, writing a couple different trilogies for a couple of different publishers simultaneously, traveling the globe. You know how we do, a book a year. Keeping that energy going. It's very impressive. So we are very thankful that you were able to carve some time to speak to us. It was really great having you on and getting to learn more about you and some of the context behind these characters and these stories. We can't recommend Evocation enough to our listeners. It was so funny. I was bragging to people. I'm like, "Ooh, I'm going to talk to S.T. Gibson. You can find her books in Target."
Once you made it into Target,
that's the big
that
wig
is
right
next
there.
level.
I think I cried when I got Target. I'm not going to pretend
big.
like I didn't. It's huge.
Yeah, that's
It's
a big
huge.
deal.
And an author really doesn't control that. It's all machinations behind the scenes. So it really did feel like it kind of fell into my lap, but I'm super grateful. But thank you guys for having me. This was a blast. You're lovely host. You asked great questions, and
Thank you.
I'm more than happy to spend a little bit of a rainy evening with you guys talking about this book.
Well, Saint, thank you so much. The pleasure was all ours. Guys, remember Evocation by S.T. Gibson, book 1 of the Summoner Circle. It comes out tomorrow at the time of this recording, so make sure you grab a copy and then head on over to Target and grab the rest of S.T. Gibson's books, and then be on the lookout for all those other exciting releases coming up the next couple of years. UK listeners, tickets are selling out fast. You gotta get on that. So
better hurry up.
Better hurry up. If I was in the UK, I'd get a ticket, but I'm not.
Yeah,
so
hey, there you
plan
go.
out a trip to get over there to Comic Con or something. But Saint, where's the best place for people to find you on the old interwebs, social media, websites, all that kind of stuff?
Totally. You have 3 options. Number 1, best, is my newsletter, which is saint.substack.com. It is free. It is usually about monthly, maybe twice a month. And that is where all the info about cover releases, new book deals, sales, and a little bit behind the scenes on what I'm working on and what I've been watching and reading lately is. There's also a paid version, which is the Apocrypha. You can sign up at the same place. And that is for essays on writing craft, how I create my books, and also the publishing industry. So it's great for folks that are interested in growing their craft and getting published or continuing to publish. That's number 1. Number 2, I'm on Instagram quite a bit at ST Gibson Author. Find me there. If you want to DM me, go ahead, feel free. And I am in and out of Twitter because I used to be a big time Twitter girly, and it's really, really hard to completely cut that out of my life. But I will be on it for a week and then not on it for a week. So it's not as reliable.
It's bad now.
It's rough. I mean, it's sad, but arguably the account is still live. It's S_T_Gibson. But I suggest just do newsletter and Instagram, and you'll see more of me than you probably want to see. It'll be great.
Oh, well, that's well said. And I just subscribed us to to Saint's newsletter. So we're looking forward to that. I was like, I'm going to write that down now. I've got the chance. So
I'm literally working on the next one right now. Your timing is perfect.
So we're just in time. All right, guys. Thank you all so much for listening. Saint, thank you again for coming on. We had a blast, and we're looking forward to talking about this book in more detail when it actually comes out. So thank you all for listening. You guys are great, and as always, go forth and conquer, friends.